All right. Thank you all for coming tonight. Today, we are very, very pleased to have with us. We have a very special guest today for Book Law Presents a Conversation with. We have with us Ambassador John Bolton, who we are very thankful for joining us today on this wonderful occasion. Um, Mr. Bolton is the former National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump, as well as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations for former President George W. Bush, as well as serving on numerous high-level positions within administrations for Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. Former Ambassador Bolton is here today to speak about his new book, or his book, and now in a paperback edition, The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. Mr. Bolton has also been incredibly gracious to sign copies of the book, and those are available here. You can see on our live stream, there is a link for the paperback edition, which has a new forward on recent events with Donald Trump. Mr. Ambassador Bolton, we are very thankful for having you here today.
Well, thank you very much for having. Look forward to it.
Absolutely. And so as we start the conversation, I wanted to kind of start off by asking you, can you describe the motivations and the aspirations you had when writing this memoir in regards to your time in the Trump administration and what you wanted Americans to get out of it as they were reading it? And then how has the last couple of years with the behaviors and current events that currently surround the former president, how does that reaffirm that kind of decision-making process when you decided to craft this book?
Well, I had written a book about my time at the United Nations and the George W. Bush administration, and I had basically the same motivation in mind on the room where it happened, and that is to try and open up the process of what actually happens inside the White House in decision making, certainly on national security matters. A lot of books are written about the presidency as it unfolds. Each administration has a lot of media people who write books, other outsiders, uh, but it's not so common. Maybe becoming more common, but not so common for somebody who's actually participated in the decision making. And it's I think it's important because memories fade, or worse, they become fixed in what the speaker or the writer wishes had happened during the administration. So being able to talk about it in real time, I think, is important, and it turns out even more important than I thought, because the administration's leader is running for president yet again. And so this is an opportunity for voters to see what it's like inside the sausage factory, not with a series of anecdotes, but what I hoped was a readable description of how policy unfolded, how decisions were made. And I wrote it so people could really draw their own conclusions, and to be a record for history, not just a long list of adjectives and adverbs and characterizations, but the actual facts of what happened. As I say, people can uh, come to differing conclusions, but it was important to get on the record what actually happened. And it's something that media reports don't give. They typically rely on anonymous sources. I put it all out in my name, and you can have at it. In terms of the paperback, the new paperback, which is just coming out a couple months ago, the forward describes what a second Trump term would look like, based in my case on what I thought the lessons learned from the first term were, now 3.5 years removed from the end of the first term, and what it might mean in terms of Trump's unpredictability in a second term. And again, uh, people are going to have to face this choice, as we now know, in November, and they'll come to their own conclusions. But this is a look at what I think a second Trump term would look like, based on what I learned in the first term.
Absolutely. And so, as we look back on your experiences during the first term, I kind of picked out a couple of spots within the book, kind of like giving like a full picture of your time there. And so I wanted to talk about your experience with at that moment three previous Republican administrations. You had a vast experience in working in the Oval Office, and I wanted to discuss how did the kind of outsider mentality that the Trump administration observed, how did that kind of hinder its ability to kind of form a solid foundation for governance in those kind of initial days as you're kind of entering and you're seeing the slew of resignations and kind of situations as you were entering in?
Well, I came in April of 2018, so over a year had gone by, but I was a regular visitor in the White House, including talking with Trump during that term. And my observation is that Trump came into office not knowing anything about how the federal government worked, never having served in the government at any level before. He had a big pre-election transition effort by Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, that they literally threw into a trash can the day after they won the election. And they started over an entirely new transition effort. And then in the early days in the White House, that was led by and large by people who had never been in the executive branch of the federal government. There were people who knew about Washington, Mike Pence, perhaps paramount among them, but you could walk the halls of the White House, and it was rare to find somebody who had ever been in a White House before, who had ever been in part of the federal government before. And as I say, I would go over there in the first year, and I felt like being in a college bull session. You'd sort of be in somebody's office talking, somebody else would walk in, start talking to them. I could have stayed all day, and I kept thinking to myself, don't these people realize there's a government to run out there? So I think Trump wounded himself very badly because he didn't know what he was doing when he started, and he didn't care that much about learning. He didn't seem to understand the reach of the government outside the walls of the West Wing. And I don't think he ever really recovered from that. It could be that there was no way that he would have accepted the discipline of learning more about the government. I don't think he ever accepted the discipline I thought was inevitable for somebody in the national security area, like every one of his predecessors who had felt the gravity of the decisions they had to make, the weight of their responsibilities. That didn't discipline Trump, and maybe they're not what wasn't anything. So he came into office not knowing much about the government or how it works, and he left not knowing very much more. And the last 4 years haven't added to that limited stock of knowledge. He's going to come in again, I think, with a different agenda this time, because it's as I explained in the forward, it's really going to be aimed at retribution for his earlier adversaries, including the people he thinks denied him reelection in 2020. That's not a forward-looking agenda for the problems the country has. His agenda is not different than what it was in 2016, but it's added on this element of retribution.
And can you add on further onto that thought? In what ways do you think both Republicans and Democrats are kind of not fully grasping what a second Trump term would mean? In what ways are they not fully understanding that?
Well, I don't think many people appreciate that he is really stuck where he was at the end of the first term. Times have changed, new threats are out there, new problems. That's not what Trump's thinking about. He's thinking about how, in his mind, the 2020 election was stolen from him, and he wants to go after the people that he thinks stole it from him. He wants to go after his adversaries or his enemies, in his view, from his first term. Mark Milley, for example, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, now retired, did a great job, in my view, as chief of staff in difficult circumstances, especially during the Trump years. Trump has said that, back in the day, people got hung for treason, and that Milley committed treason by talking to his Chinese counterpart at one point to say, the don't pay any attention to the turmoil back here. This too will pass, and there's no effort here to deceive China or anybody else into thinking that we might be planning an attack. That's just responsible carrying out of Milley's duties as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and yet Trump wants to go after him. He's serious about this. He's very serious about this. He has not updated his plans or his interest to take into account the perilous new time that we live in. And so a lot of the second Trump term will be backward looking. And I think the other side that many people are not paying attention to is that Trump will be a lame duck on day one. He can't get a third term. The Constitution's clear on this. The limit is 2 terms, not 2 consecutive terms, 2 terms. So the quality of people he'll attract with by definition only a 4-year time horizon, shrinking rapidly day by day, it makes the Trump second term worse than second terms normally are, where you don't get the quality of people who are eager to join up at the beginning of a new president's early days, but are less likely to be willing to go through all you have to do in terms of disclosure and conflict of interest analysis and all the rest of it to serve only maybe for a couple of years in a second Trump term. And then I think the final thing is Trump has so many issues that he wants to resolve that are going to cause chaos in the government itself, real constitutional questions when he orders the Department of Justice to go after his adversaries, and even some of the people he appoints will say, well, Mr. President, we can't do that. And he's going to fire them. Or if they're career people, they're going to face the difficulty of either saying no or resigning or getting fired. And that's true not just at the Justice Department, at the Pentagon and the intelligence community, perhaps in the Homeland Security Department. We're going to have a government that because Trump in the White House will be surrounded by yes men and yes women, the rest of the government is going to bear the brunt of a lot of Trump's efforts just to ignore constitutional constraints and institutional constraints that have helped the government do its job in a limited way over much of our recent history.
And to kind of further on this discussion of kind of the impulses that the former president has in regards to how he deals with like world leaders and policy, you write really is a really interesting chapter in chapter 11, the Hotel Noi titled chapter, where you have your recollection of the Hanoi summit between President Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un. And you kind of paint President, or at least from reading the book, it paints President Trump as a person who's whose personal issues and his need for deal making as problematic. And so, can you talk about how, as national security advisor, you're in this area where you're trying to present sound policy strategy, and how this kind of this impulse for getting the best deal or the best sounding deal in a media perspective, how that kind of is a problem for U.S. national security interests.
Right. Well, Trump comes to national security with no particular philosophy. He had never thought about it before he became president in any systematic way. He certainly didn't do so during his first term, and he I don't think has done so in the years since then. He doesn't think in policy terms as we normally understand that concept in Washington, which is you pick an objective and try and work your way toward it. Every day is a new day. I like to say his decisions in his first term were like an archipelago of dots. I mean, each decision was out there. You could like it or dislike it. You could try and draw lines between the dots, but you would fail because Trump couldn't draw lines between the dots. And that in that relates in substantial part to the transactional approach that he brought to decision making. Maybe that's the way you become a success in the real estate market. I can't say one way or the other, but it's not just, well, how does this deal look, and am I going to get the most out of this deal? International relations are a lot more complicated than that. And I will say quite boldly here, Trump couldn't care less about that view. He thought relations between the United States and South Korea, North Korea, doesn't matter whether the country is an ally or an adversary. the relations between two governments consisted of whether the heads of state of those governments had a good personal relationship. So if he had a good relationship with Kim Jong-un, if he had a good relationship with Vladimir Putin, that meant that North Korea or Russia-U.S. relations were good. That's simply not true. I'm not saying personal relations can't be important. Of course they can, but the hard men of international relations, Putin, Kim, Xi Jinping, the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, have clear ideas of what they think their respective national interests are. And personal relations aren't going to get in the way of them pursuing those interests. So they looked at Donald Trump, who was very happily talking about how he and Kim Jong-un fell in love. And in Kim's mind, he's saying that this guy is not serious. Trump thinks he's got a great relationship with all the strong men that he's dealt with. Uh, they're happy that he thinks he's got a good relationship with him because they see him not as a peer, they see him as an easy mark. And that's very dangerous for US security.
And how does this erratic kind of way of policy making. You write in great detail about how you would have moments in the White House where Trump would have these kind of open ended discussions with different factions within the administration, and you yourself are presenting detailed briefings, and how all that could just be undermined with like a phone call with like Xi Jinping and just kind of bloviating his ego. How is that frustrating not only to you as a national security advisor, but how can that be detrimental to our allies as we're trying to get an understanding of sound U.S. policy?
Yeah. Well, the whole national security mechanism that we have for decision making was set up, it's evolved over time. Its main purpose is to serve the president. Because the government it's a huge, vast bureaucracy, and each department has its own internal cultures and disagreements. It's a sociologist's dream world to describe all this. But because the departments tend to have different perspectives, they have different internal bureaucratic cultures. The individuals leading them have different points of view. That somehow there had to be a way to help the president who makes the hard decisions. If you're president, you don't get to make any easy decisions, except maybe pardoning the Thanksgiving turkeys. All the easy decisions are made by the geniuses who work for you. You get all the decisions they couldn't figure out what to do about, or where there's real disagreement. So to enable the president to perform his job, the National Security Council is intended to make sure that the options are thoroughly considered before they're presented to the president, that he knows the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons. He can have national security meetings to chew all that over, so that he feels most comfortable making hard decisions, setting broad policies. And that process can be bureaucratic. There's no doubt about it. It can sometimes be frustrating and slow. A president can bypass it if he wants to. There's nothing uh, preordained about it. It's to help the president make decisions. And Trump just didn't live within that structure. It was, sort of the last person in the door was just as likely to have his or her view accepted as the entire rest of the bureaucracy laboring through this process to try and flush out what the options are and to allow the president to make judgments on which were better. And then on the other side of a presidential decision, to make sure that the decision was actually implemented, which Trump never paid much attention to. When Eisenhower had been elected in 1952, Harry Truman said, poor Ike, this was before the national security process really had evolved. He said, poor Ike, this is not going to be anything like the Army. He's going to come in and say, do this, do that. Nobody's going to pay any attention. And that is a problem. The bureaucracies go on. Presidents come and go, the bureaucracies go on. So it's not just helping the president make the decision, it's helping be sure the president's decisions are implemented. Trump didn't understand any of that. He didn't care much about it. Again, he thought everything that mattered was what he said or what he said to Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, his counterparts, as if the rest of the government wasn't there really to help him implement his policies. And this inability to come to grips with the fact that the government has enormous capabilities really only understood by Trump in limited ways. He knew what the tariff power was. It's an important power, but it's hardly the alpha and the omega of the government's capabilities, particularly in national security.
And before we get to our last question, as someone who went into undergrad, political science, I'd be remiss if I didn't get to ask you a question about policy. As the country and the world kind of writ large is kind of going back into this kind of status quo of great power competition, you're a person with bona fide, conservative credentials. What do you believe, a future, Republican Party in regards to, foreign policy? How are they going to meet those interests in a way that, is something that is conservatively principled in its approach?
Well, I'm very worried about the current spread of isolationism within the Republican Party. I think you can attribute a lot of it to Trump, but there's always been an isolationist strain in the party, sometimes more powerful, sometimes less. I'm concerned and surprised at how widespread the isolationist impulse is, because it's not going to serve American interest well. And I think we've had, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, that American politicians have not leveled with the American people on what we need to do to deal with the external threats that we face to the country. And now they're more and more serious, from China, from Russia, from North Korea, from Iran, from the continuing threat of terrorism, nuclear proliferation. You can't just say, well, we've got, as Trump did the other day in an interview with Nigel Farage, we've got a great ocean out there between us and Europe. Well, that's great. Missiles at ballistic speed or hypersonic speed, even more quickly, can come across that ocean in a matter of minutes. So it's a different world than George Washington faced in the late 18th century, and maybe better, or maybe worse, but that's the world we live in, and you can't pretend that we don't. I don't think Trump grasps that, and I think that's a big risk, particularly for the Republican Party, which has been just in recent years Ronald Reagan's party of peace through strength, which I continue to think is the proper approach.
And then before we open it up to a couple of audience questions, I wanted to finish out with saying or asking, the book finishes with the epilogue, and you write about the impeachment proceedings with President Trump and in regards to Ukraine. And you've had several detractors kind of criticize your decision to not testify before those hearings. Now that we've kind of been several years removed, and we've witnessed the aftermath of that, has history kind of vindicated your decision? Why or why not?
Well, I think especially if you look at not just the first impeachment proceeding against Trump, but the second impeachment proceeding, it's not enough just to have impeached him. Nancy Pelosi said famously, Trump will always be impeached. Well, that's great, but he will twice always have been acquitted. And if the goal of impeachment, first impeachment or the second, because of January the 6th, was to convict Trump, punish him, or at least restrain and deter him from the kinds of conduct that led to both impeachments, by definition, they failed. And I would say it's worse than that. That the failed impeachments in both cases didn't constrain or deter Trump. They emboldened him. They empowered him. They convinced him he could do it and get away with it. So by looking only at impeachment and not thinking, what's the arithmetic of getting 2/3 in the Senate to convict him, it really played into Trump's game plan, and unfortunately made him more convinced than ever that, as he once famously said, he could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nothing would happen to him. we didn't actually impeach and convict Richard Nixon, but what happened was support in the Republican Party for Nixon collapsed because of the Watergate hearings and the appreciation for what he had done. And people should remember it was then Senator Jim Buckley of New York, a conservative, not even elected on the Republican Party line, who really led the way in saying that Nixon had to resign, or otherwise he would be impeached and convicted. If you want to get rid of a president, you need 2/3 in the Senate. That's a fact. It was a mistake in hindsight for Republicans to impeach Bill Clinton in his second term for the Monica Lewinsky scandal, because there was no way he was going to be convicted. Now, maybe they could have gotten to a point of getting 2/3 of the Senate to agree, but it didn't happen. So this is a feel-good, virtue signaling kind of approach, both with Clinton and twice with Trump, that actually leaves the target of the impeachment in a stronger position after the process fails. So, as a political matter, the whole thing, I think, was a mistake, and helped Trump with his narrative that poor man, he's just being picked on. And now that's a mantra of his campaign and part of his retribution effort in a second term. So I think, in fact, the proponents of Trump impeachment hurt their own cause.
All right. And on that note, we will ask a couple of audience questions and then we will wrap this up. Um, let's see. We have a question from Allison. She writes, what what was the process like of like collecting notes and recollections and putting together this book? Did you get any I think she's trying to ask if you had received any kind of roadblocks in the process of making the actual book. If you wanted to
If you wanted
elaborate
to
on that.
elaborate. Right. Well, I had to go through what's called pre-publication review, which for people who have received security clearances, it's a commitment that you make. You can argue about how broad that obligation was, but I went through it, and I'll tell you, it was Trump was trying to prevent the book from ever being published, and I talk a little bit about it in the epilogue, and I also talk about it in the forward, because what he tried to do in seeking an injunction against my book being published, even though I had gone through the complete process, which was difficult and took 4 months to do, to make sure there was nothing classified in the book. I didn't think there was from the get-go, but I wanted to get the book published, so I went through the process, and that didn't stop Trump, because he didn't care about the classification issue, as we can see from his own handling of classified documents after he left the White House. He knew the book would be critical, and he wanted to stop it because he didn't want to see a critical book published. That's the sort of abuse of the pre-publication review process that has worried people for a long time. And in the next 4 years of Trump, if that's what we get, you're going to see an awful lot more of that. And that will cause damage to the Constitution, because he doesn't care about constraints of things like the First Amendments. He cares about the reputation of Donald Trump more than that.
And then lastly, when someone asks, very apropos, who will you be voting for in this coming election?
Well, in since it looks like a repetition of 2020, I'm going to do the same thing I did in 2020. I live in Maryland, where you can write in names of candidates. So I wrote in the name of a conservative Republican in 2020, because I didn't think there was a conservative Republican on the ballot, and I will do that again. People have said, "Well, look, one or the other of Trump or Biden is going to win." I understand that argument. In 2016, I agreed with that argument. I voted for Trump rather than Hillary Clinton, who she and her husband were a year ahead of me in law school. I like to say I'd been burdened with them a lot longer than the rest of the country. I certainly wasn't going to vote for her. But after working for Trump for 17 months, I just didn't think he was fit to be president. And we're in a very unpalatable situation in 2024, as we were 4 years ago, where we've got two candidates neither one is fit to be president. So the country will have to pay that price. And if we don't like voting for Trump or Biden, you have to find alternative candidates who can beat them. And neither party did that, which I think is a pretty sad commentary.
Well, once again, thank you, sir, for joining us today. The book is The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. Ambassador John Bolton, thank you very much. Folks, if you want to get a copy, we have links in the description box for the new paperback edition as well as hardcover editions. Ambassador Bolton has been very gracious to sign copies as well. And once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, and thank everybody who participated in this for doing it. I appreciate all of you taking the time. I was happy to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.